"Bruno, are you okay?" Karol G asked, her voice suddenly cutting through the music. Bruno Mars stopped for half a second and looked straight at her. The band was still playing softly, but Karol could see something had changed in his face. She stepped closer, holding her microphone with both hands. "You don't have to hide it from me," she said. Bruno took a slow breath and looked toward the crowd. Thousands of people were watching, expecting the next line of "Still." But Karol wasn't looking at the audience anymore. She was looking only at Bruno. Then she reached for his hand. Bruno smiled for a moment, but his eyes were already wet. "I'm fine," he whispered. Karol shook her head. "No, tell me the truth." The music faded almost completely. The crowd became quiet as Bruno turned back toward her. Then Karol suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Bruno froze before returning a hug. Cameras caught the moment, but what they captured next was even harder to explain. Bruno leaned toward Karol and quietly said something that made her pull back, stare at him in disbelief, and wipe away a tear. Whatever he had just told her had nothing to do with the performance, and Karol's next decision would change the entire night. The interrupted moment the music came back, but something between Bruno Mars and Karol G had already changed. The stage lights moved across the arena as the opening notes of "Still" filled the room again. Bruno lifted his microphone and tried to continue, but Karol stayed beside him. She watched his face carefully, almost as if she was waiting for him to say something he had been holding back all night. Bruno looked at her, gave a small smile, and nodded toward the band. "Let's keep going," he whispered. Karol nodded, but she didn't move away. The first verse began. Bruno sang a few lines, and the crowd immediately joined in. For a moment, everything looked normal. Two stars sharing a stage. Two voices moving together. But then Bruno missed a line. It was only one line, barely noticeable to most people, but Karol noticed immediately. She turned toward him. Bruno looked down at the floor and took another breath. The camera moved closer, catching the hesitation in his eyes. Karol reached toward his arm. "Look at me," she said quietly. Bruno looked up. She smiled, trying to make him laugh. "We've got this." Bruno finally laughed under his breath. The tension eased for a second. Then the music stopped again. Not because Bruno asked for it. Not because Karol asked for it. The band simply followed Bruno's sudden movement as he lowered his microphone. He looked toward the side of the stage, then back at Karol. She immediately understood that this was no longer part of the planned performance. "What is it?" she asked. Bruno didn't answer. He walked closer to her and spoke so quietly that even the cameras could not catch his words. Karol's expression changed instantly. Her smile disappeared. She looked at Bruno for several seconds before asking, "You're serious?" Bruno nodded. The arena was still waiting. Thousands of fans had no idea what was happening. Karol looked at the crowd, then back at Bruno. She could have simply continued the show. Instead, she made a choice that would turn a planned performance into something neither of them would ever forget. The bond long before that night on stage, Bruno Mars and Karol G had learned something important about each other. They did not need to agree on everything to trust each other. Bruno was precise. He could spend hours changing one line, one beat, or one small part of a performance until it felt right. Karol was more instinctive. She trusted emotion, movement, and the feeling of the moment. At first, those differences sometimes created tension. Bruno would stop and say, "Wait, try it again." Karol would laugh and answer, "You always want one more take." Bruno would smile, "Because I know you can make it better." That simple exchange became part of their creative relationship. They challenged each other without trying to compete. During rehearsals, Bruno would stand near the piano, listening closely while Karol tested different melodies. Sometimes he said nothing. He simply watched. Karol learned to recognize that silence. It meant he was thinking. And Bruno learned that when Karol suddenly stopped singing and stared at him, she usually had an idea that could change the entire arrangement. One evening, after a long rehearsal, Karol noticed Bruno sitting alone near the edge of the stage. The lights were mostly off. His microphone was still in his hand, but he wasn't speaking. She sat beside him without asking questions. For several seconds, neither said anything. Then Bruno finally said, "Do you ever get tired of all this?" Karol looked at him. "Of the music?" Bruno shook his head. Of having to be strong. Karol understood immediately. She didn't give him advice. She just leaned back and said sometimes, but you don't have to be strong with me. Bruno looked at her and smiled. That was the kind of friendship they had built. It wasn't based on famous names, sold-out arenas, or perfect performances. It was built in quiet moments when neither of them needed to pretend. They joked during rehearsals. They argued over arrangements. They stayed late when something wasn't working. And when one of them doubted themselves, the other noticed before anyone else did. Karol admired Bruno's discipline, but she also saw the person behind it. Bruno admired Karol's confidence, but he also saw how much courage it sometimes took for her to step onto a stage and give everything she had. That mutual understanding slowly changed the way they worked together. They stopped trying to impress each other and started trusting each other. And that trust would soon become more important than either of them realized, because the moment that interrupted still wasn't caused by a mistake in the music. It came from something personal, something Bruno had kept to himself, until Karol noticed the one thing he could no longer hide. The shared dream, what Bruno Mars and Karol G wanted, was simple to say, but difficult to achieve. They wanted to create a performance where the music felt completely honest, without the pressure to prove anything to anyone. They wanted the audience to forget, even for a few minutes, that they were watching two global stars. They wanted people to feel the connection between two artists who trusted each other enough to be vulnerable on the same stage. Bruno wanted the arrangement to stay simple. Karol wanted to leave room for emotion and spontaneity. What if we don't plan every second? Karol asked during rehearsal. Bruno looked at her and smiled. That sounds dangerous. She laughed. Exactly. But behind the jokes was a serious idea. They both knew the performance could fail if they pushed too far. Bruno was used to controlling every detail. Karol understood that some of the strongest moments happened when artists stopped controlling everything. So they made a promise. If something unexpected happened, they would trust each other instead of panicking. It sounded easy during rehearsal. It wasn't. As the night of the performance approached, Bruno became quieter. Karol noticed it but didn't push him. She simply stayed close during rehearsals, checking his expression whenever the music stopped. One evening, Bruno finally told her, I want this to mean something. Karol looked at him and answered, then don't perform it. Feel it. Bruno smiled, but her words stayed with him. They had spent weeks preparing the music, but neither of them knew that the real test would have nothing to do with singing. On the night of the performance, they walked onto the stage with the same plan they had practiced again and again. Bruno held his microphone. Karol stood beside him. The first notes of Still began. The crowd erupted, then slowly became quiet as the two voices came together. For a few minutes, everything worked exactly as planned. Bruno looked at Karol. Karol smiled back. Then Bruno's expression changed. It was small, almost impossible to notice. But Karol saw it. She knew that look. Something was wrong. And within seconds, the dream they had spent weeks building together was about to face the one thing neither rehearsal could prepare them for. The next note of Still should have been easy. Bruno lifted the microphone, but he didn't sing. The band kept the music low, waiting for his signal. Karol turned toward him and immediately saw the change in his face. The stage lights were still moving across the crowd, but Bruno seemed completely focused on one point in front of him. Karol stepped closer. Bruno, she asked. He didn't answer. His breathing became slower. He lowered the microphone and looked toward the side of the stage. Karol followed his eyes, then looked back at him. What happened? Bruno finally whispered. I just remembered something. She waited. What? Bruno looked at her, but before he could answer, the music stopped. The sudden silence spread across the arena. Tens of thousands of people stopped cheering. No one knew why the song had been interrupted. Karol moved closer to Bruno. Do you want to stop? She asked. Bruno shook his head. No, I want to finish it. Karol studied his face for a moment. She could see that he was fighting his emotions, but she also knew he didn't want the audience to see him break down. Then she noticed something else. Bruno's hand was shaking slightly around the microphone. Karol gently placed her hand over it. Then don't do it alone, she said. Bruno looked at her. For several seconds, neither moved. The cameras captured their faces as the crowd slowly realized that something real was happening. Bruno took a breath and nodded. The piano began again, softer this time. Karol started singing the next line, giving Bruno space to recover. He joined her a few seconds later. Their voices were quieter than before, but the entire arena was listening. Then, in the middle of the song, Bruno stopped again. Karol turned toward him, expecting another interruption. Instead, Bruno looked directly into her eyes and said, "I can't ignore it anymore." Karol's expression changed. "Then tell me," she whispered. Bruno looked toward the crowd, then back at her. What he said next was so personal that Karol's eyes immediately filled with tears. She stepped forward without thinking and pulled him into a hug. The music stopped completely. For the first time that night, there was no performance left to protect them. There were only Bruno and Karol, standing together in silence while the crowd waited to discover what had broken through Bruno's carefully controlled exterior. The choice Karol kept her arms around Bruno for a few seconds, but neither of them moved. The arena was almost completely silent. Bruno looked down, tried to control his breathing. Karol slowly stepped back and looked into his eyes. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. Bruno nodded. "Please." That one word changed the mood on stage. Karol could have asked the band to continue. She could have turned the moment back into a performance. Instead, she lowered her microphone and stood beside him. Bruno wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked embarrassed for a moment, then gave a small laugh. Karol smiled. "You don't have to apologize." Bruno shook his head. "I just didn't expect this." Karol answered softly, "Neither did I." The band members waited, watching the two artists decide what to do next. Bruno looked toward the musicians, then back at Karol. "Should we keep singing?" he asked. Karol paused. She knew they could pretend nothing had happened, but she also knew that would go against everything they had promised each other during rehearsals. "Only if you really want to," she said. Bruno took a deep breath. He looked at the audience, then at Karol. "Duh, but not the way we planned." Karol smiled. "Then let's change it." Bruno nodded. The arrangement changed immediately. The bright stage lights faded. The piano became softer. Karol moved closer to Bruno, leaving enough space for him to breathe. Bruno raised his microphone again. His voice was still unsteady, but he started singing. Karol joined him, not trying to cover his emotion, but supporting it. For the first time that night, they weren't trying to deliver a perfect performance. They were simply trying to finish something together. Bruno looked at Karol halfway through the verse. She gave him a small nod. He continued. Then Karol reached for his hand again. Bruno held it tightly. The crowd began to react, but neither of them looked away. They had made their choice. They would not hide the difficult moment. They would face it together. And as the final part of the song approached, Bruno leaned toward Karol and whispered, "Thank you for staying." Karol smiled through her tears. "I told you. You're not doing this alone." Neither of them knew yet that the next few seconds would turn that private promise into the most emotional moment of the entire performance. The piano continued with only a few soft notes, and Bruno stood beside Karol without saying anything. For several seconds, neither of them sang. Bruno looked at Karol, and she gave him a small nod. That was all he needed. He raised the microphone and started again. His voice was quieter now, but more honest. Karol joined him, matching his pace instead of trying to lead. The crowd slowly stopped cheering. Thousands of people simply watched. Bruno's eyes moved toward Karol as they reached the next line. She smiled at him, even though tears were still visible on her face. Bruno smiled back. Then Karol reached for his hand. He held it tightly. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it said everything they were not able to say out loud. The camera moved closer as Bruno took another breath. "Thank you," he whispered. Karol answered, "Always." Bruno looked down, trying not to cry again. Karol squeezed his hand once. "Finish it with me," she said. Bruno nodded. The music slowly grew stronger. Their voices came together, and this time there was no hesitation. The audience began singing along, but Bruno and Karol stayed focused on each other. Near the final notes, Bruno turned toward Karol and pulled her into a hug. Karol immediately wrapped both arms around him. The music continued behind them, but neither moved. The crowd erupted. Bruno closed his eyes for a moment, resting his forehead near Karol's shoulder. Karol held him tighter. When they finally stepped apart, Bruno looked at her with a small, emotional smile. Karol wiped her cheek and laughed softly. "You made me cry on stage," she said. Bruno laughed too. "You started it." For the first time that night, the tension broke. They both smiled. But then Bruno looked toward the audience and became serious again. He lifted his microphone and said, "This is why we do music." Karol stood beside him and nodded. The crowd went silent again. What had started as an interrupted performance had become something much more personal. And neither Bruno nor Karol realized that the hug everyone had just witnessed was only the beginning of the real story. The applause slowly faded, but Bruno and Karol remained on stage together. Neither wanted to rush into the next song. Bruno looked at Karol and smiled. "You okay?" he asked. Karol laughed softly and wiped her cheek. "I'm better now." Bruno nodded, then looked down at their hands. They were still holding each other. He finally let go, but Karol immediately bumped his shoulder. "You owe me after this," she joked. Bruno looked. "For what?" "For making me cry in front of everyone." Bruno smiled. "You hugged me first." For a moment, the heavy mood disappeared. The crowd laughed with them. It was a small exchange, but it showed something important. They could move from tears to laughter without pretending the emotional moment had never happened. Then Karol became serious again. She turned toward Bruno and said, "You know what I realized?" Bruno looked at her. "What?" "We don't need a perfect night." Bruno stayed quiet. Karol continued, "We just need to be honest." Bruno nodded slowly. Those words clearly meant something to him. He looked toward the audience, then back at Karol. "That's why I trust you," he said. Karol smiled. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." Bruno laughed and shook his head. "That's a dangerous promise." "Too late," she replied. The crowd cheered again. Then Bruno walked toward the piano and sat down. Karol stood beside him. Instead of returning to the original arrangement, Bruno played a few simple notes. Karol immediately recognized them. She looked at him with surprise. "You remembered?" she asked. Bruno nodded. Of course. They had written those notes during one of their earliest rehearsals, long before anyone knew they would perform them together. It had never been part of the official set list. It was their private musical idea, something they had almost forgotten. Karol stepped closer to the microphone. "Should we do it?" Bruno looked up and smiled. "Let's do it." The first note filled the arena. The crowd became quiet again. This time, there was no fear, no interruption, and no pressure to prove anything. Bruno played. Karol sang. Then Bruno joined her. Their voices blended naturally, and for a few seconds, they looked at each other and smiled like two friends who had completely forgotten they were standing in front of thousands of people. But hidden inside, that little melody was something Karol had never heard before. Bruno had changed one part of it. She noticed immediately. She stopped singing and looked at him. "Bruno, when did you change that?" Bruno smiled but didn't answer. Karol stared at him, realizing the new ending was not just a musical change. It was connected to the secret he had been carrying all night. The next morning, Bruno and Karol returned to the rehearsal room, but neither of them treated the previous night like just another performance. Bruno placed the same piece of paper on the piano. Karol noticed it and smiled. "You kept it?" she asked. Bruno nodded. "I think I need it." Karol sat beside him. "Then keep it." They laughed quietly. But beneath the laughter, something had changed. Bruno no longer felt that every performance had to be perfect. Karol no longer felt that she had to hide her emotions when something mattered to her. They had discovered that their strongest moments did not come from getting everything right. They came from trusting each other when things went wrong. Bruno looked at the piano and said, "I used to think success meant control." Karol replied, "And now?" He looked at her. "Now I think it means knowing when to let go." Karol smiled. "That's better." From that point on, their creative process changed. Bruno became more willing to leave space for unexpected moments. Karol became more patient with the details Bruno cared about. They still disagreed. They still joked. They still challenged each other. But now there was a deeper understanding between them. During one rehearsal, Karol made a mistake and immediately stopped. "Sorry," she said. Bruno shook his head. Don't apologize. Try it again. She looked at him and smiled. You learned something? Bruno looked. Maybe I did. Then they started again. This time, the mistake became part of the arrangement. Neither of them tried to erase it. They kept it. For Bruno, that was a major change. He had spent years building performances around precision, but Karol had reminded him that real emotion could not always be rehearsed. For Karol, Bruno had taught her something equally important. Emotion becomes stronger when you respect the craft behind it. Their friendship became a balance between instinct and discipline, freedom and control, emotion and technique. And when they returned to the stage, the audience could feel the difference. Bruno looked more relaxed. Karol looked more confident. They no longer needed to prove that they belonged together on that stage. They already knew it. Before one final rehearsal, Karol walked past Bruno and quietly said, "You okay?" Bruno smiled. "Yeah." She stopped. "Really?" Bruno nodded. "Really?" Then he looked at her and added, "Because you stayed." Karol smiled back. "I'd do it again." And this time, Bruno didn't need to say anything. The silence between them said enough. What began as one difficult night had changed the way they saw music, friendship, and success. And the next time they stepped onto a stage together, they would carry that lesson with them. Months later, Bruno and Karol stood on another stage together. The lights came on, the crowd began to cheer, and for a moment, everything looked exactly like a normal concert. Bruno looked at Karol. Karol looked back and smiled. Neither needed to mention that night. They both remembered it. The first notes began, and this time Bruno didn't look nervous. Karol stood beside him, calm and confident. When they reached the final part of the song, Bruno paused for a second. Karol noticed and smiled. "Ready?" she asked. Bruno nodded. "With you." They continued. The crowd sang along, but Bruno and Karol seemed focused on something much smaller, the trust they had built between them. After the final note, they looked at each other and laughed. No dramatic speech was needed. No explanation was necessary. Karol simply stepped forward and hugged Bruno again. This time, Bruno hugged her back immediately. The crowd erupted, but neither of them rushed to separate. When they finally stepped apart, Bruno looked at Karol and said, "Thank you for staying." Karol smiled. "Always." Those two words had become more than a response. They had become a reminder of what their friendship meant. For Bruno, the experience had changed the way he viewed success. He learned that not every important moment could be planned, controlled, or perfected. For Karol, it proved that sometimes the greatest support you can give someone is simply refusing to walk away when they are struggling. And together, they discovered something even more valuable. Music could bring people together, but trust was what made the connection last. The audience may remember the hug. They may remember Bruno's emotional expression. They may remember Karol standing beside him when the music stopped. But for Bruno and Karol, the real memory was much simpler. One friend looked at another and asked, "Are you okay?" And when the answer was difficult, she stayed. That was the moment that changed everything. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And perhaps that is the legacy of Bruno Mars and Karol G. Not just the songs they create, not just the stages they share, but the quiet reminder that behind every famous face is a human being who sometimes needs someone to stay. And when the final lights faded that night, Bruno looked back at Karol one last time. She smiled. He smiled back. Then they walked off the stage together, leaving the audience with one simple truth. Some performances end when the music stops, but the moments that truly matter stay with you long after the last note is gone. The stage was empty now. The lights had gone down. The crowd had begun to leave, and the last sound from the arena was slowly disappearing. Bruno walked back onto the stage alone for a moment, looking at the spot where he and Karol had stood together earlier. He smiled to himself. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Karol appeared with 2 bottles of water in her hands. "Still thinking about it?" she asked. Bruno looked. "A little." She handed him a bottle and sat beside him at the edge of the stage. For a while, they said nothing. No cameras were in front of them. No crowd was waiting. There was no music to hide behind. Bruno finally looked at Karol. "You know what scared me?" She turned toward him. "What?" Bruno took a breath. "That people would only remember me breaking down." Karol shook her head. They'll remember you trusted someone. Bruno looked at her quietly. Those words seemed to reach him. You really think that? He asked. Karol smiled. I know that. Bruno looked toward the empty seats. Earlier, thousands of people had been watching them. Now there was only silence. He realized that the most important part of the night had never been the applause. It had been a moment when Karol noticed he was struggling and chose not to walk away. Karol leaned back and looked at the stage. We should do that ending again someday. Bruno smiled. The one I changed? Yes. What? Karol laughed. Because now I know what it means. Bruno shook his head, smiling. You always have to know everything. Someone has to, she replied. They both laughed. Then Bruno became quiet again. Thank you, Karol. She looked at him. For what? Bruno answered simply. For seeing me. Karol didn't joke this time. She nodded and said, That's what friends do. Bruno smiled. They stayed there for another few minutes before, finally, standing up. As they walked toward the backstage entrance, Karol stopped and looked back at the empty stage. Bruno noticed. What? He asked. She smiled. Nothing. Just remembering. Bruno nodded. Then they walked away together. The night had started with a planned performance, but it ended with something neither of them could have rehearsed. A friendship that had been tested in front of thousands of people and came out stronger. And somewhere behind that empty stage, the final notes of Still seemed to remain, not as a perfect performance, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing two people can give each other is simple. I'm here. I am staying. A few days later, Bruno and Karol met again in the studio. There was no audience this time. No cameras. No stage lights. Just a piano, 2 microphones, and the quiet sound of them preparing another session together. Bruno sat at the piano and played the ending from that night. Karol listened without interrupting. When he finished, she smiled. It still feels different, she said. Bruno looked at her. Different good. Karol nodded. Different real. Bruno smiled and looked down at the keys. That's all I wanted. Karol walked over and sat beside him. For a moment, they simply listened to the silence. Then she asked, Do you think we'd make the same choice again? Bruno didn't hesitate. Yes. Karol smiled. Even if nobody understood, Bruno looked at her. Especially then. They both laughed quietly. The difficult night had become a memory, but it had also become something more. It had changed the way they trusted each other. Bruno no longer felt the need to hide every difficult emotion behind a perfect performance. Karol no longer felt the need to fill every silence with words. They had learned when to sing, when to laugh, and when simply to stay beside each other. Bruno played the first notes again. Karol started singing softly. This time, there was no interruption, no unexpected problem, no dramatic moment, just 2 friends making music. And somehow, that simple moment felt more powerful than anything that had happened on the stage. When the song ended, Karol looked at Bruno and said, Ready for the next one? Bruno smiled. Always. She stood up and offered him her hand. Bruno took it, and together they walked toward the microphones. The cameras, if they had been there, might have searched for another emotional hug or another shocking moment. But there was nothing dramatic to capture. Just trust. Just friendship. Just 2 artists who had learned that the best performances are not always the ones that go according to plan. Sometimes, the most important moment happens when the music stops, someone asks, Are you okay? And the other person finally feels safe enough to answer. For Bruno Mars and Karol G, that moment became a reminder they would carry into every stage that followed. The lights would change. The crowds would come and go. The songs would evolve. But the promise would remain the same. If one of them ever struggled again, the other would stay. And perhaps that was the real meaning behind Still, not simply a song, not simply a performance, but a reminder that some connections survive the silence, the pressure, and even the moments when everything goes wrong. When Bruno pressed the final key, Karol looked at him and smiled. He smiled back. Then the room went quiet, and for once, neither of them felt the need to say anything. The next time Bruno and Karol walked onto a stage together, there was no special announcement about what had happened before. No explanation. No attempt to recreate the emotional moment that had touched so many people. They simply walked out, looked at each other, and smiled. Bruno adjusted his microphone. Karol took a breath. Then the music started. For a few seconds, they sang without looking at each other. But when the first difficult part arrived, Bruno turned toward Karol. She was already looking at him. That small moment said everything. They had learned how to recognize each other's silence. They knew when to step closer and when to give space. They knew when a joke could break the tension and when no words were needed. Halfway through the song, Karol made a small mistake. She stopped for a second and looked at Bruno, expecting him to laugh. He did. She laughed too. The crowd laughed with them, and suddenly the pressure disappeared. Bruno pointed toward her and said, "See? That's better." Karol shook her head. "You planned that." "Absolutely not," Bruno replied. They continued singing, smiling at each other. It was not perfect, and that was exactly why it felt right. Near the end of the performance, Bruno stepped closer and lowered his microphone. Karol did the same. For a moment, they simply stood there. Then Bruno said, "Still here?" Karol smiled. "Still here." The crowd reacted immediately, but Bruno and Karol didn't play it up. They just nodded to each other and finished the song. Afterward, backstage, Karol handed Bruno the same folded piece of paper from their earlier night. Bruno looked surprised. "You kept this?" he asked. Karol smiled. "You gave it to me." Bruno unfolded it and read the sentence again. He looked at Karol, then carefully folded the paper and placed it inside his jacket. "I don't think I need it anymore," he said. Karol raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Bruno smiled. "Because now I remember." Karol nodded. There was no dramatic reaction. She simply touched his shoulder and said, "Good." They walked down the hallway together as the noise of the arena faded behind them. Their story had started with a song, but it had become something much bigger. They had learned that friendship isn't always about having the right words. Sometimes it is about noticing a change in someone's face, reaching for their hand, and staying when they have nothing to say. Bruno and Karol didn't know what the future would bring. They didn't know how many stages they would share or how many songs they would create. But they knew one thing. Whatever came next, neither of them would have to face it alone. And when the next door opened, Bruno looked at Karol and smiled. She smiled back. Then they walked through it together. The following night, Bruno and Karol were back on stage. But this time they had agreed on one thing. No surprises. They wanted a clean performance. Simple. Controlled. Nothing that could go wrong. Bruno checked his microphone twice. Karol looked at him and laughed. "You're nervous again." Bruno smiled. "I'm being careful." "Same thing," she replied. The music started. The first few minutes went perfectly. "Bruno sang." Karol answered. They moved across the stage with the confidence of two artists who knew exactly where the other would be. Then, near the final part of Still, Bruno looked at Karol and suddenly smiled. She immediately knew something was coming. "What?" she whispered. Bruno shook his head. "Nothing." Karol narrowed her eyes. "I don't believe you." He laughed and continued singing. But then he stopped near the last note. Karol stopped too. The crowd waited. Bruno turned toward her and said, "You remember what you told me?" Karol looked confused. "Which thing?" Bruno smiled. "That we don't need a perfect night." Karol's expression softened. "I remember." Bruno nodded. "I finally understand it." The music faded. Karol stepped closer. "What changed?" Bruno looked at her for a moment before answering. "You did." Karol froze. The crowd became quiet. Bruno continued. "You taught me that being there matters more than being perfect." Karol looked down, trying to hide her emotion. Then she looked back at him. "You taught me the same thing." Bruno looked softly. "So, we're even?" Karol smiled. "Not even close." The crowd laughed, and the tension broke. Then Karol opened her arms. Bruno stepped into the hug without hesitation. This time, there was no shock, no confusion, and no sadness. It was simply two friends celebrating how far they had come. When they separated, Bruno looked toward the audience. "We wrote this song together," he said, "but tonight, you made it yours too." The crowd erupted. Karol stood beside him, smiling. Then Bruno turned back toward her. "Ready?" Karol nodded. "Always." The band started again. Their voices filled the arena, stronger and calmer than before. And as they reached the final note, the two of them looked at each other and smiled. No interruption. No fear. No hidden message, just trust. The performance ended, but this time neither of them felt like something was missing. They had finally understood that the most powerful part of their story had never been the song itself. It was everything that happened between the notes. After the applause ended, Bruno and Karol walked backstage together. The hallway was crowded with crew members, but neither of them paid much attention to the noise around them. Karol looked at Bruno and asked, "Did you mean what you said?" Bruno knew exactly what she meant. Every word. She smiled, but then her expression became serious. Even the part about me changing you, Bruno nodded, especially that part. They stopped near a quiet corner backstage. Bruno leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. "You know what I realized?" Karol shook her head. "I spent so much time trying to make every moment perfect that I almost missed the moments that mattered." Karol looked at him for a few seconds. "And now?" Bruno smiled. "Now I notice them." Karol nodded slowly. She knew exactly what he meant. The hug, the silence, the unfinished song, the small gestures that no audience could fully understand. None of those moments had been planned, yet they had become the memories that mattered most. Karol reached into her jacket and pulled out the folded piece of paper again. Bruno looked surprised. "You still have that?" She smiled. "I told you, I keep important things." Bruno took the paper and opened it. The sentence was still there. He read it quietly, then looked at Karol. "I think I finally understand why you gave this back." Karol raised an eyebrow. "What?" Bruno folded the paper carefully. "Because I don't need to be reminded anymore." Karol smiled. "Exactly." For a moment, they stood there without speaking. Then Bruno suddenly laughed. Karol looked confused. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing. I just remembered how scared I was that night." Karol laughed too. "You were terrified. I was trying to hide it. You were terrible at hiding it." Bruno pointed at her. "That's why I need you around." Karol smiled. "Good answer." They started walking again. Before reaching the dressing rooms, Bruno stopped and turned back toward her. "Karol." She looked at him. "Yeah. Thank you." She smiled. "You already said that." Bruno nodded. "I know. I just wanted to say it again." Karol stepped closer and gave him a quick hug. This time, there were no cameras, no cheering fans, and no dramatic music. Just two friends who understood exactly what the other had been through. As they separated, Karol whispered, "We're still making that song better." Bruno looked. "Tomorrow. Tomorrow." They walked away together, already talking about music again. And that was the part the crowd never saw. The real story didn't end when the lights went off. It continued in quiet rooms, late rehearsals, unfinished melodies, jokes, disagreements, and two people who had learned that trust could be more powerful than any performance. The stage had given them a moment, but what happened after the stage gave them something much harder to lose, a friendship they both knew they would protect. The next afternoon, Bruno arrived at the studio earlier than usual. He walked straight to the piano and placed his phone on the floor beside him. A few minutes later, Karol walked in carrying coffee. She looked at him and smiled. "You started without me?" Bruno shook his head. "I was waiting." Karol placed the coffee beside the piano. "Good, because I have an idea." Bruno turned toward her. "That usually means trouble." She laughed. "Maybe." They spent the next few hours working on the song again. Bruno changed the rhythm. Karol changed one line. Bruno disagreed. Karol argued back. They laughed. Then they tried it again. This time, the music sounded different. Not bigger, not louder, just more honest. Bruno stopped playing and looked at Karol. "That's it." She nodded. "I think so too." He played the ending again. Karol closed her eyes and listened. When the final note faded, she didn't speak. Bruno looked at her. "Too much." She opened her eyes. "No, it feels like us." Bruno smiled. That sentence stayed in the room for a few seconds. Then Karol asked, "Do you want to release it?" Bruno paused. That was the question they had avoided. The song was personal. Too personal, maybe. It contained pieces of everything they had experienced together, including the moment when Bruno had struggled on stage and Karol had refused to leave him alone. Releasing it meant letting strangers hear something that belonged to them. Bruno looked at the piano. "I'm not sure." Karol nodded. "Then we don't have to." He looked at her. "You'd be okay with that?" "Of course." Bruno smiled. "That's why I trust you." They didn't make a decision that day. Instead, they saved the recording and closed the studio. But before leaving, Bruno looked back at the piano. Maybe someday. Karol smiled. Maybe. Months passed. They continued working on other projects, performing, traveling, and building their careers. But the song remained untouched. Every time one of them mentioned it, they laughed and changed the subject. Until one evening, Bruno sent Karol a short message. "I think I'm ready." She knew exactly what he meant. The next morning, they returned to the studio. No big announcement. No cameras. Just Bruno at the piano and Karol standing beside him. They listened to the old recording. Neither spoke when it ended. Then Karol looked at Bruno. "Still want to keep it?" Bruno smiled. "No," he pressed the button again. "I want people to hear it." Karol nodded. But before they could start recording, Bruno stopped. "One condition." Karol raised an eyebrow. "What?" Bruno smiled. "The ending stays exactly the way we wrote it that night." Karol smiled back. "Deal." And as the recording began, neither of them realized that the song they once thought was too personal to share would soon become the clearest reminder of why their friendship had survived every difficult moment. Not because they had always known what to do, but because when one of them didn't know, the other stayed. The studio was quiet when Bruno pressed the record button. No cameras, no audience, just the soft sound of the piano and Karol taking a slow breath before the first line. Bruno looked at her through the glass. Karol nodded. They began. This time, there was no hesitation. Bruno's voice sounded calm. Karol's voice came in beside him, warm and steady. The song moved exactly as they had imagined, but when they reached the final section, Bruno stopped playing. Karol looked at him through the microphone. "What's wrong?" Bruno smiled. "Nothing. I just want to hear you finish it." Karol looked surprised. "Alone." Bruno nodded. "You know the ending." She took a breath and began singing. Bruno stayed silent, listening from the other side of the room. His eyes slowly became wet. When Karol reached the final line, she looked at him. Bruno pressed the final piano note. Silence filled the studio. Neither moved. Then Karol removed her headphones. "Was that okay?" Bruno smiled. "It was perfect." She laughed. "You hate that word." Bruno shook his head. "Not today." Karol walked into the room and sat beside him. They listened to the recording again. When the final note played, Bruno leaned back and closed his eyes. Karol watched him. "Are you thinking about that night?" she asked. Bruno nodded. "Yeah." "Does it still hurt?" He opened his eyes. "Not the same way." Karol waited. Bruno continued. "Back then, I thought being vulnerable would make me weaker." He looked at her. "You showed me it could do the opposite." Karol smiled. "You showed me that too." They sat quietly for a moment. Then Bruno reached for the phone and played the first rough recording they had made months earlier. The difference was obvious. The first version was uncertain. The new one sounded confident. But the emotion was still there. Karol laughed when she heard the old take. "We were a mess." Bruno looked. "A beautiful mess." Karol looked at him. "Don't get poetic now." Bruno smiled. "So They laughed again. Then Bruno saved the final file. He gave it a simple name. Still, Final. Karol looked at the screen. "That's it." Bruno nodded. "That's it." She smiled. "No dramatic title?" "No." Bruno looked at her. "The story already has one." Karol understood. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. The song was no longer about one difficult night. It was about everything that came after. The trust, the mistakes, the laughter, the quiet conversations, and the choice to stay. Before they left the studio, Karol turned off the lights. Bruno stood beside her at the door. He looked back one last time. "Ready?" he asked. Karol smiled. "Always." They walked out together, leaving the final recording behind. For the first time, the song no longer belonged only to them. Soon, other people would hear it. And neither Bruno nor Karol knew how deeply those listeners would connect with a story that had started with one simple question: "Are you okay?" The song was finally released, but Bruno and Karol didn't know what to expect. They had spent months protecting something that felt deeply personal. Now it belonged to anyone who pressed play. Bruno sat alone in his studio that morning, listening to the first few seconds. His phone began filling with messages. Karol called. "Have you seen the reaction?" Bruno smiled. "Not yet." "You should." He opened his phone. The comments were already coming in. People were talking about the emotion in their voices. Some were asking about the meaning behind the ending. Others were simply saying the song made them call someone they loved. Bruno stopped scrolling. That last comment stayed with him. He called Karol back. "You know what's strange?" he said. "What?" "People don't know our story, but they still feel something." Karol smiled on the other end. "Maybe they don't need to know everything." Bruno nodded. "Maybe." Later that day, they met again. This time, the studio felt different. The song was playing quietly through the speakers while they sat across from each other. Karol looked at Bruno. "Are you happy we released it?" Bruno thought for a moment. "Yeah. No regrets." He shook his head. "None." Karol smiled. "Me neither." Then Bruno looked toward the speakers. "But you know what matters most?" Karol waited. "That we didn't change the ending." She smiled. "I told you. That part stays." They listened again. When the final note arrived, Bruno looked at Karol. She was smiling. "It sounds like that night," she said. Bruno nodded. "Because it is." For the first time, they understood that the song didn't need a complicated explanation. The emotion was enough. The silence was enough. The simple decision to stay was enough. And as the song reached more people, Bruno and Karol kept doing what they had always done, making music, challenging each other, laughing, and showing up when the other needed support. Fame had made their lives complicated, but their friendship had become surprisingly simple. If Bruno needed someone, Karol answered. If Karol doubted herself, Bruno reminded her what she was capable of. They didn't always have solutions. They didn't always have the right words, but they were there. And that was the lesson behind the song. Not every connection needs a dramatic ending. Some of the strongest bonds are built quietly, one conversation at a time, one rehearsal at a time, one difficult night at a time. And sometimes, one simple question is enough to change everything. "Are you okay?" For Bruno and Karol, the answer had become something they no longer needed to say out loud. They already knew. "I'm here. I am staying." The final performance of Still came months later, in front of another packed arena. Bruno and Karol stood side by side as the lights dimmed. Neither spoke before the music began. They didn't need to. Bruno looked at Karol. She gave him the same small nod she had given him on that difficult night. The piano started. The crowd immediately recognized the song and began cheering. Bruno smiled, but Karol could see that he was thinking about everything that had happened since the first performance. They started singing. This time, Bruno's voice was steady. Karol's voice came in beside him, just as it had before. But near the final section, Bruno stopped. The crowd went quiet. Karol turned toward him. For 1 second, she looked worried. Then Bruno smiled. "I'm okay," he said. Karol smiled back. "I know." The audience reacted with a wave of applause. Bruno looked softly. The old fear was gone. He didn't need to hide anything anymore. He didn't need Karol to rescue him. He simply knew she was there. They finished the song together. When the final note ended, Bruno lowered his microphone. Karol stepped closer. They hugged, but this time the hug wasn't about sadness. It was about everything they had survived together. Bruno whispered, "We did it." Karol answered, "Together." The crowd erupted. Bruno looked toward the audience and then back at Karol. He raised her hand. She laughed and shook her head. "Don't make this dramatic." Bruno smiled. Too late. They walked toward the front of the stage and bowed together. The light stayed on for several seconds before slowly fading. Backstage, Karol looked at Bruno and asked, "Was that really the last one?" Bruno nodded. "I think so." She smiled. "Good." Bruno looked surprised. "Good." Karol nodded. "Because now we can make something new." Bruno looked. "You already have another idea, don't you?" She smiled. "Of course." They walked down the hallway together, already talking about the next song. Behind them, the stage was empty again. The last performance of Still was over, but the story that inspired it wasn't. It had become part of who they were. Bruno had learned that vulnerability didn't make him less strong. Karol had learned that sometimes the best thing you can give someone isn't an answer, but your presence. And together, they had learned that friendship isn't measured by how loudly someone supports you when everything is going well. It's measured by who stays when the music stops. As they disappeared backstage, Bruno looked at Karol one final time. "Ready for whatever comes next?" She smiled. "Always." And this time, there was no fear in either of them, just the quiet confidence that whatever happened next, they would face it together. But just when Bruno Mars and Karol G thought the story of Still was finally over, Karol received one unexpected message that made her stop in the middle of the studio. She looked at Bruno without saying a word. "What happened?" he asked. Karol slowly turned her phone toward him. Bruno read the message once, then again. His expression changed. The person who had watched their performance that night had remembered one detail nobody else seemed to understand. The moment Bruno stopped singing, the moment Karol held his hand, and the reason she refused to leave his side. Bruno sat down quietly. "They heard it," he said. Karol nodded. They understood. But there was something else in the message. It wasn't praise. It wasn't an invitation. It was a question, one that brought them back to the exact moment everything had changed. Karol looked at Bruno and whispered, "Do you think we should tell them the truth?" Bruno didn't answer immediately. He looked at the piano, then at Karol. After everything they had kept private, one decision remained. They could leave the story exactly where it ended, or they could reveal what really happened before that unforgettable hug. Karol reached for his hand again. Bruno held it, and before either of them could say another word, the studio door opened. Someone was standing there with something Bruno had never expected to see again, the original note that had started everything. What was written on it could change the way everyone understood that night.